let's take a look at the storage configuration for the iSCSI LUN that we have on our SAN. Let's take a look at the path configuration. So we go to our host, go to configure, storage devices, and select our iSCSI LUN there, and go to paths. And we'll see here the paths there. Now, I've only got one path to that storage array. You might remember, if you've watched the Virtualization Essentials course, then you will have noticed that we provisioned our iSCSI through the one network adapter that we had on the host at the time. But I also said that that's not how you would normally do it, that you would normally have a dedicated NIC for that. And I've waited until now to move on to the next stage where we are going to configure the iSCSI properly. Now that we've been through networking, we understand vSphere networking a little bit more clearly. So let's take a look at physical adapters. You can see I've now got 4 network adapters. 2 of them are on my distributed switch that we configured at the end of the previous module. However, 2 are completely empty, and these have been attached to a dedicated iSCSI switch, which has those network adapters and my iSCSI SAN, my FreeNAS device. So the first thing we need to do to make iSCSI work on these devices, we need to create some networking configuration. Now you can do this on a distributed switch, but I'm going to do it on a standard switch just for simplicity. So add networking. Now we're going to say we want to create a vmkernel network adapter because it will support our iSCSI, and you can see there that it tells you that's what you want to do. So next. Now we want to create a new standard switch. Now for iSCSI, I strongly recommend changing the MTU to 9,000 bytes. Now you will need to make configuration changes on your switch to support that. So if you are not able to do that, then leave it at 1500. But if you can and you're comfortable making your changes on your switches, I do strongly recommend changing it to 9,000 bytes for iSCSI, also known as jumbo frames. I'm going to assign the adapters to it. I'm going to assign both of those adapters. I'm going to call this iSCSI 1. And you'll see in a moment why I've called that iSCSI 1. I'm going to leave these all unticked because we configured the iSCSI port binding separately to this. There's no entry here for iSCSI. IP settings, we want IPv4 only for our purposes. And I'm going to set static IPv4 addresses. I'm going to use 192.168.250.11 for this host, 255.255.255.0. The default gateway we're not going to be using on this vmkernel NIC, so that's fine, we'll just leave that as it is. So we can now see we have an additional vSwitch here, which has been named vSwitch 0 by default. It's got our 2 iSCSI adapters and our vmkernel NIC here. Now, we're going to the iSCSI settings. Now, what you're supposed to do, this is the VMware best practice, is go into the vmkernel NIC. Your iSCSI vmkernel NIC should be assigned to one adapter only. So we're going to move that down to the unused adapters. This is going to be on vmNIC2. Now you might be wondering, that doesn't make any sense. Surely we would want to use both adapters. What you need to do is add an additional vmkernel NIC and map that to the other physical NIC. So same process again, we'll call it iSCSI 2. IPv4 settings. Now, for this one, I am going to use a different subnet. Now, this depends on the device that you are using as your SAN. My FreeNAS only allows me to bind IP addresses to NICs that are in different VLANs. I can't, in different subnets, sorry. I can't have multiple NICs with different IP addresses on the same subnet. That's why I need to do this with separate IP addresses. What you sometimes find if you look at the best practices document for the iSCSI SAN that you're deploying, whether that be Dell or HPE or whatever, that may well specify something like this. It's similar to what we call zoning configuration in FibreChannel, but essentially some of the ports should be on one subnet and some of the ports should be on another, and that creates two separate fabrics through which the traffic can be managed, rather than it being one big subnet where it's a free-for-all. But it all depends on the best practices document from the storage vendor. We've now got our other vmkernel NIC. We go to storage adapters, look at our software adapter, and into network port bindings, say add, and we can see there is one iSCSI port group there. The other one's actually missing, and I've just realized I have in fact missed the port mapping, so I'll just add that there. We'll just pop back to our virtual switch. I didn't change the teaming configuration, so we're going to edit settings, teaming and failover. We now move that onto the unused adapters. So we now have iSCSI 1 uses that adapter. If we click it, you can see it shows this. Do iSCSI 1. There we go. And now when we go into port bindings and add, it lets me add the other one. Now that's an interesting quirk there. It didn't show me those ports. It didn't allow me to bind those ports to the iSCSI software adapter because it knew that the configuration wasn't correct. You'll also notice on the existing one there, the vmkernel 0, it says not compliant again because it knows that that config is not valid. And I think probably the only reason it actually let me add it at the time was because it was the only adapter on there. The next thing I'm going to do, go to Dynamic Discovery, and I'm going to add a different portal. So 192.168.250.1 is the FreeNAS's IP in the iSCSI switch, and 192.168.251.1 is its other IP address. There we go. The other port will show up. There we go. Now let's do rescan storage. Let that rescan. Now with that rescan completed, we can now see an extra couple of paths there. Now we're now going to remove the old objects, so we're not using the main NICs anymore. Remove that from there. Right, now rescan the adapter. We can see just two active paths there, and that change has actually happened completely non-disruptively. We can do that if we had users working on the servers on this platform actively right now. They wouldn't have noticed anything whatsoever.